Early 2012, Jonathan Levine, owner of the New York gallery of the same name, offered me a personal exhibition in Miami at the end of the year during the International Contemporary Art Fair. Miami, a city in southern Florida, is well known for its beaches, laid-back lifestyle, Art Deco architecture, and its highly renowned contemporary art fair. Jonathan Levine is a native of Philadelphia, an ambassador of lowbrow who loves to disguise himself as a Teletubby. In the late 90s, he met Shepard Fairey, with whom he discovered street art. Without abandoning his first passion, Jonathan moved his gallery to New York in 2005 and became one of the important figures of this movement. I accepted his proposal and decided to go to Florida a few months early to work in Miami and prepare a new book documenting my invasion of the city, thus extending the series of invasion guides and maps begun with other cities. Oh, by the way, I didn't introduce myself. I am Invader. I have often been called the UFO of the art world. And indeed, for about 15 years now, my main activity has been scattering space invaders to the four corners of the planet. I call them invasions. Specifically, they are mosaics, made up of large or small tiles cemented to walls. In this way, I have given form to all sorts of creatures originating from the first generation of video games, placing them in public space. They are all referenced in a database, and I traveled the world with the obsession of spreading more. Paris, London, New York, Tokyo, but also Kathmandu or Mombasa. To date, I have invaded about 60 cities around the world. One last thing. I always act incognito. I had already made a first wave of invasions in Miami in November 2010 when I agreed to participate in the Wynwood Walls, a project for which I had been invited to produce a large piece on a 2nd Avenue wall in the heart of Wynwood. As usual, I took advantage of my stay there to place a few additional pieces throughout the city. At that time, I met the legendary photographer Martha Cooper, who immortalized some of my interventions. I left Miami with a first score of 28 space invaders in the city. I was also looking for an idea that would be the highlight of this exhibition, and which would fit to the reputation of this international artistic event. If you look at a map of Florida, you see that Miami is located just south of the Space Coast, NASA's favorite spacecraft launching site. Getting up to space. That is the project. Having spent the last 15 years scattering space invaders to the four corners of the planet, I dreamed to send, or should I say, return one to space. Especially since this area is generally reserved for telecommunications equipment or military and scientific missions. But to my knowledge, it had never been exploited for artistic purposes. A terra incognita was within my reach. But hey, easier said than done. More than once I had considered the matter. But the problem of how remained. Alas, I do not know anyone working at NASA, and my knowledge of astrophysics is quite limited. In surfing the net, I discovered that now one can easily send a meteorological balloon into the stratosphere. and that several sites give advice and indicate the necessary equipment for just such an operation. From then on, I had only one obsession: to assemble a device that would allow me to send a creation into space and bring back the images of the operation. With the help of my partner, Jetag, we spent the few months until we left for Miami conceiving our first spacecraft. A mix of high-tech gadgets and makeshift that would send our mosaic baptized Space One into space. I'll spare you the technical details, but here is the principle. An airtight box containing a camera focusing on Space One and a GPS tracker that would give us its position every 10 minutes. Also attached to the plate supporting the mosaic is an RFID chip for a more precise sighting during recuperation of the craft in the last 15 meters. This device is surmounted by a radar reflector linked to a parachute, which is attached to a large helium balloon that will take off with all the equipment. Atmospheric pressure decreases with altitude, leading to expansion of the gases and thus the balloon. At some point it will burst, and the aircraft, still subject to gravity, will begin a steep descent slowed down by the parachute. Then, we will only have to locate the landing point to retrieve the camera and the film it contains. We are the 5th of August, 2012. And we arrive in Miami, having sent on ahead all the necessary material for the launch, as well as a big supply of tiles and glue for the second wave of Miami invasions. Awaiting favorable weather condition for the project that I named ART4SPACE, the invasion of the city gets underway, and new space invaders soon began to appear in the city. Regarding the space launch, I contacted a local journalist at the Miami Herald Tribune who would accompany us and document the ART4SPACE operation. Glenn Garvin, who usually does chronicles of television series, would be going along with us. We gave him an appointment on August 15 in the parking lot of the Children's Museum. We load the car with all the necessary material for the operation and drive to the meeting place. We're dressed in white jumpsuits bearing the ART4SPACE insignia. Glenn's photographer refuses to follow us to the launch point, which is a 3-hour drive. So we do a quick portrait under MIA 48, the piece I had placed a few nights earlier on the wall of the museum. It is still there. We finally take the road to the Space Coast and head to a predetermined point located in the Everglades agricultural area. The day before, we had performed flight simulations at particular sites. By entering variables such as the weight to be carried, the size of the balloon, and the amount of helium it contained, the program retrieved weather data for a day and a specific launching point to carry out a flight simulation. After numerous simulations, we decided upon this place as conducive to a good flight. We figured that the balloon should drift about 100 miles northwest of the launch point before falling to Earth, thus avoiding the ocean, the Everglades, and the big lake Okeechobee. We take a path that leads to field of sugarcane, a perfect place. A farmhand is watching us, but probably convinced that we're with NASA, he leaves us to our preparations without daring to come too close. We install our mini launch pad under the watchful eye of Glenn, the journalist, who takes photos and notes. We begin to inflate the balloon with a huge bottle of helium that we rented the day before. We empty the entire bottle, but the balloon does not seem fully inflated, and we soon realize not enough to send off our gear. However, according to our calculations, one bottle should have been quite sufficient. Spirits sagging, we hit the road back to base. Bad weather compromises the flight for the following days. So we wait for the weather to improve while continuing to invade the streets of Miami. We don't waste a minute. This second wave is intense, with a large number of big pieces, ending up at the airport with MIA 72. This wave reaches a score of 44 new pieces, bringing the total number of Space Invaders in Miami to 72. Finally, August 20th is a beautiful day. We'll leave early in the morning, this time with 2 bottles of helium, but no journalist. Ironically, on the road, we discover that Glenn Garvin's article has made the front page of that day's Miami Herald. It describes the presence of the Space Invaders in Miami and the failure of our first space launch. Now, precisely in the same place as last time, we install our launch pad. Sweltering heat and the strong sunlight makes things difficult. Sweating profusely in our plastic jumpsuits, we cannot see anything on the screens of our devices. To our surprise, 1 bottle is more than enough to fill the balloon. Nothing would now seem to hinder our climb to the stars. I tried to take one last photo before takeoff, but it's so hot that my cell phone is too overheated. I fear for the camera going up with the balloon. If it stops recording now, the entire operation will be reduced to 0. We no longer waste a moment and release the balloon. At that moment, I am entranced by the ascension of the balloon while Jatag is worrying about the temperature of the helium bottles. We're both following our spacecraft that has begun to spin. We pack up the remaining elements of our launch base, ready to hit the road to follow the balloon. We have left the launch site and are trying to keep our eyes on the balloon. It has become a small white dot and is approaching a thick bank of cumulus clouds. The balloon is going into the clouds, and we lose sight of it. The launch seems successful. It's a good start, but only a beginning since, until I retrieve the device, nothing is won. The GPS system sends us its location every 10 minutes, at least while it is still in the first layer of the atmosphere, the troposphere that covers the first 7.5 miles above the Earth. After an hour, we lose the signal, meaning that it has now reached another layer, the stratosphere. At this altitude, there are no airplane, no network, or perhaps no battery, because the temperature has now fallen to minus 112 degrees Fahrenheit, twice as cold as the minimum temperature indicated on the lithium batteries that run our equipment. Nearly 3 hours after the launch, we receive another signal, meaning that the GPS is still functioning and that it has returned to our atmosphere. The balloon reappears on our screens due south, just above the Everglades, opposite from where we expected it. Luckily, the winds make it drift northward to the designated area. 4 hours after liftoff, we repeatedly receive the same coordinates. Our spacecraft is stabilized. It has landed. We are amazed to discover that according to the last GPS coordinates received, it is on the side of a road in the small town of La Belle, about 60 miles from our launch site. We go there and find the road in question, bordered by abandoned fields and a few houses. We arrive at the point indicated, but do not see it. We connect the wireless RFID locator that is supposed to beep if we are less than 50 meters from the chip embedded in our spacecraft. It remains silent. We walk along the road on each side of the indicated point, nothing. We comb the fields beside the road, still nothing. Yet the red parachute in this green environment should be easily detectable. While the satellite images showed us dry fields with bushes, the reality is quite different. The fields are dotted with ponds and covered with thick wild vegetation. As for the bushes, they turn out to be tall trees linked by thorny vines. We finally run into a local farmer and ask him if we can cross over his fields. He accepts, but warns us. "You must strike the ground with a stick to frighten the snakes. And don't walk on those mounds of earth. Those are fire ant mounds." Red ants whose bite burns like fire. And don't go over there. That's the alligator lake. What? He points to a pond a bit further away, affirming that an alligator lives there. We asked the residents of a few houses in the vicinity whether they had seen anything fall from the sky, with no result. And we hesitate to venture into a sort of underground river that borders the road. But something is not right. The locator should be beeping, especially as every 10 minutes we continue to receive a GPS signal indicating exactly where we are. In spite of this, we persist until nightfall and then until the batteries of our telephones that we were using as flashlights run down. Nothing. We are forced to admit that we will not find it, let alone at this hour of the night. Just before leaving, a sheriff comes up to us, probably alerted by residents worried about having seen two men in white jumpsuits inspecting the surroundings. Totally discouraged, we return to Miami. Game over. Exhausted by this day and distraught by this failure, the ART4SPACE operation seems compromised. All the material accumulated over the past few months, lost. But I can't help thinking that the camera has to be out there somewhere. And I keep asking myself, what have we not thought about? The GPS coordinates continue to appear every 10 minutes, always the same ones. We can't throw in the towel now. So once again, we enter these coordinates, not on a telephone this time, but on a computer. Strangely, they no longer designate the side of the road, but the middle of a field more than half a mile further down. We realize that whatever GPS coordinates are entered into a telephone, its program systematically positions them along a road. The next morning, we leave early for LaBelle. The signal is coming from a field a few hundred meters from the road, and we circumnavigate it trying to get as close as possible in the car. After several attempts, we find the best road but are quickly blocked by fences, which we climb over, and under a blazing sun we continue on foot. We negotiate several private properties, cross several abandoned fields, being careful to tap the ground with sticks and avoid the alligator pound. The vegetation becomes denser, and we have to jump over barriers and barbed wire. We thought we would get to the point indicated within 10 minutes, but in fact, it took several hours to get there. Then we come to an open clearing and step up the pace. Suddenly, the locator emits a first beep, then a second. I think it was at that moment that I saw it. First the red parachute, then the shredded balloon, and finally, Space One and its camera. I quickly notice a few holes resembling burns in the parachute, but Space One seems intact. Not a tile is broken. We recuperate our evidence and start out on a long walk to our car, followed by the several-hour drive required to return to our base in Miami. We would then be able to insert the memory card into our reader, and if the camera worked well, see what these images from space reserve for us. This is what we discover.
Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars, let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, baby, kiss me. Fill my heart with song and let me sing forever.